Welcome to week 6 of our 7 Weeks with St. Joseph series. I'm Dr. Mike Martocchio. In this series, we're taking just a couple minutes every week to reflect on St. Joseph in different ways. Today, we're talking about St. Joseph as a model of faith, a man who places his trust in God and who acts upon it. He made him lord of his household and prince over all of his possessions. You'll sometimes see that phrase in some of our St. Joseph devotions within the church. It's a scriptural phrase, and we use it to refer to St. Joseph, but it actually doesn't come from the New Testament. It's actually from Psalm 105, and it refers in context to the Old Testament figure, Joseph, who, you'll remember, was sold into slavery in Egypt by his brothers, suffers greatly there, and because of his ability to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, a God-given gift, eventually rises to power within Egypt, only to eventually encounter his brothers who, not recognizing him, come to seek help from him during famine. Now we see here the typology with St. Joseph in the New Testament, who was not given lordship over the house of Pharaoh or one of his officials like Joseph in the Old Testament, but is rather given that role within the Holy Family by God the Father, a much higher commission. So Joseph, like the Old Testament Joseph, is portrayed as a faithful steward, a servant of God, one who trusts God and one whom God trusts. In St. Joseph's devotions, you'll also sometimes see or hear a Latin phrase, ite ad Joseph, or go to Joseph, which is another scriptural phrase referring to the Old Testament Joseph, but that we use to refer to the New Testament Joseph. It comes from Genesis, where Pharaoh, during that time of famine that we just mentioned, that Joseph helped predict and prepare for, tells the Egyptians to go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you. So Joseph's role as wise advisor to Pharaoh and protector of Egypt, and in the story also of his father Jacob, or Israel, and his brothers, is paralleled in St. Joseph's role as the wise man of faith who trusts the messages given to him by God in dreams. Note, both Josephs interpret God's message in dreams, and acts to bring about the promised redemption of Israel and of all the nations. As we've mentioned elsewhere, Joseph's trust is demonstrated in the very act of taking Mary into his house, but it doesn't end there. Joseph's trust and docility to God's communication to him allows him to act to protect his family, to protect God's household entrusted to him in what we call the flight into Egypt, as seen in Matthew's Gospel, where Joseph protects Jesus from the persecution of Herod. Note that in this episode, just like the other Joseph, he and his household end up in Egypt. A sure sign of the typology in knowing that the Old Testament Joseph helps us understand the New Testament Joseph, and that God's plan for salvation, promised so long ago, is being brought to completion through St. Joseph. In both instances, God works through Joseph to save his people. In both instances, in fact, it's not just the people of Israel that are saved. The Old Testament Joseph winds up saving Israel from the famine by working to save those outside of Israel, the people of Egypt. The reverse is true in the New Testament Joseph. By bringing about the promised Messiah and returning the kingship of Israel to God, so in saving Israel, God, through St. Joseph, brings about the salvation of all the nations. Like Joseph in the Old Testament, St. Joseph is a man of deep faith and trust, even when times get difficult. But any story of human faith is really a story of a human response to God's faith, God's fidelity. Both Josephs are stories or figures who experience God's fidelity. In Genesis, even though Joseph suffers much and is sold into slavery by his brothers and faces other trials, God remains with him and he with God. In fact, we're told consistently through his trials that God's with him. And the point of any of the saints in our tradition is to point to God's work in their lives. And St. Joseph's story, as seen in Scripture, is a story of God's fidelity. We see that in another Joseph story, this time from Luke's Gospel, the presentation of the child Jesus in the temple. The famous canticle of Simeon, or the Nunc Dimittis, that's part of the night prayer of the Liturgy of the Hours, speaks of God's fidelity being demonstrated here through the line of Joseph. Now, Master, you may let your servant go in peace, according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation, which you prepared in the sight of all the people, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and glory for your people Israel. In that passage, we're told that both Simeon and the prophetess Anna have long awaited the promised Messiah, and have now recognized him in the child Jesus. And to reiterate something we've said in other videos, this messianic line, this Davidic ancestry, is traced and connected through St. Joseph. So Joseph's faithfulness is a response to and a means of God's faithfulness to his people Israel and to his people everywhere. One last thought on St. Joseph as a man of faith. We've already spoken a couple of times about the silence of Joseph in the Gospels. And it's important to note that just as silently as Joseph comes into the story and carries on the work of God in Jesus' story, even more silently does he leave the written story. Now, we don't get a depiction of the death of Joseph. We presume he's died by the time Jesus' public ministry comes around, since we don't see him or hear from him. And early on in John's Gospel, we hear of Jesus at a wedding at Cana, and we're told that Mary was an invited guest, but we don't hear anything about St. Joseph. So one of the traditions of the church is to talk about Joseph as the patron of a happy death, because he presumably dies in the company of Jesus and Mary, which, as Christians and as persons of faith, is something we all desire, and really something that tells us what happiness in passing from this life to the next is all about. Note that this happy death, and a happy death of faith in general, is not about a public spectacle with mourners gathered from all around the world. Rather, it's a simple, quiet, intimate event that we don't even hear anything about in Scripture. Yet, like Joseph's humble life of faith that we do hear a bit about, it reflects what's most important and essential in a life of faith, and in the end of a life of faith, the presence of Christ.